All right, Shalom. I want to start off by giving all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahushai, Bahasham, Rakakwadash. I want to give double honors to our apostles and elders of Great Millstone who rule well in grace and peace. To you elect around the four winds, believing and pushing this truth in all sincerity. May the blessing of election be upon your houses. This is your fellow servant, Rakaya from the GMS Orlando camp, coming at you with another impromptu lesson. And tonight, I want to get into this brief news and prophecy because the Lord is sending a fire in the earth, chiefly here in America, that at this point can't be quenched. And as I was sitting here meditating on it, prophecy is a lot like a wildfire in the sense where when you think you have it all under control, there's always a new point of ignition. And we've seen how in times past, the Lord will ignite prophecy and let it die down, ignite, let it die down, ignite, let it die down. But over the course of these past few years, we've seen how the Lord has constantly blown upon the fire. All right, to the point to where now it's a raging fire. All right, it's a wildfire. And I wanted to get into these two articles I found earlier this morning because these are new points of ignition. All right, the Lord is getting ready to ignite the fire yet again upon Babylon with newly created diseases and famine. All right, which is all prophetic. But I want to start here in 2 Ezra 16 and verse 1. It says, "Woe be unto thee, Babylon and Asia. Woe be unto thee, Egypt and Syria. Gird up yourselves with cloths of sack and hair. Bewail your children and be sorry, for your destruction is at hand. A sword is sent upon you, and who may turn it back? A fire is sent among you, and who may quench it? Plagues are sent unto you, and what is he that may drive them away?" All right, and the fire and plagues that the Lord has sent upon Babylon are those that can't be turned away. All right, prophecy has become a wildfire to Babylon the Great, which is ultimately going to consume it. All right, just like the forest, Babylon will be consumed by prophecy. And at this point, we're at the point in prophecy where there are daily developments regarding end time prophecy. Daily developments. So we see how the Lord is igniting the fire constantly. All right, constantly blowing upon the fire in the earth and upon Babylon the Great, which is a very beautiful thing. All right, it's a very beautiful sight to see the downfall of our enemy, chiefly Esau Edom, the so-called white man. But I have this article here from theindependent.com, and it's entitled, "Scientists Use AI to Create Entirely New Viruses and Give Urgent Warning." Now we already understand how these elites like to move, especially concerning the CDC, when it comes to engineering these different pathogens and releasing them upon the people, and capitalizing off of that crisis. All right, and this is another attempt. All right, now it says AI has been used to create new viruses for the first time ever. And this goes to show you that this devil is not fit to rule the world. Why on earth would the ruler of the people be seeking to create viruses and create diseases? Why would anyone in their right mind seek to create and control these different things instead of ridding them from the planet Earth? But like brothers constantly get into, every healed patient is a lost customer for Esau Edom. And the majority of these people, are profit for the elites of Babylon the Great because of their sickly nature. And we've seen how that thing that was released in 2020, all right, how that was used to further the plans for the MOTB, or further the infrastructure for the MOTB. And this is going to be no different. It says AI has been used to create new viruses for the first time. And researchers, and this is not medical information, and researchers have warned that it could be the beginning of a dangerous new trend. In the new study, researchers used an artificial intelligence system to make bacteriophages, a virus that infect bacteria and are used to treat infections. The newly developed viruses are able to kill E. coli bugs and cannot be treated with naturally occurring viruses, the scientists say. But scientists warn that it could present a dangerous new moment in safety and security. The technology appears to be racing ahead of its ability to use it safely. Experts away from the study warn. All right, so Esau is in over his head yet again. All right, his own counsel essentially is casting him down. Which we're gonna get that in Job, the 18th chapter. All right, because Esau has sought heavy counsel in his development of AI. He seeks to AI, CERN, and these different mediums to give him, or to produce outcomes for him to bring forth his new agenda. And AI is getting ahead of, the council is getting ahead of himself. Ultimately he's destroying himself by his own counsel. This is Job 18 in verse 5. It says, "Yeah, the light of the wicked shall be put out, and the spark of his fire shall not shine." When you get into that word light, one of the definitions is prosperity. And the prosperity of Babylon is being put out. All right, all windows are being darkened for America. The council, the economy, the social aspect, the monetary aspect, all windows are being darkened for Babylon the Great. And a lot of that darkening is self-inflicted. A lot of the darkening that's taking place amongst the house of Edom is self-inflicted. It says, "The steps of his strength shall be straightened, and his own counsel shall cast him down." We see how his own counsel is starting to cast him down. Even his AI is getting ahead of itself and creating these different diseases that don't have any cures, that don't have any way, they don't have any way to secure this technology, to make this thing safe, so to speak. But the Lord also spoke about there being pestilences in the last days. This is Matthew 27 and verse 7. It says, "For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places." All right, and this is another pestilence that's getting ready to overtake the world, all right, especially Babylon the Great. A new engineered pestilence. The Lord spoke about newly created diseases, and this is one of them. This is one of them that Esau is using AI to create, in which he ultimately can't control. It says, "Appears to be racing ahead of its ability to use safely." Although this is promising for life sciences applications, it also raises urgent biosafety and biosecurity questions. It says, "The ability to compose viral genomes using generative AI now exists. The governance to safely steer it does not." All right, so although Esau is seemingly moving forward with his technological advancements, all right, he's ultimately, as he takes one step forward, he's taking 3 steps back. He doesn't, he can't control it. His own counsel is casting him down. All right. And while he's doing all of this, he doesn't realize that he's bringing forth prophecy. All right. He's igniting the fire on his own ass. He's ignited the fire on his own ass concerning World War III, concerning the mark of the beast, and now concerning pestilence, concerning earthquakes, because he's constantly fracking, trying to extract oil from the earth. All right, he's ignited the fire on his own ass. And because of his pride, he's not going to stop. He's not going to stop destroying himself. He's going to continue until there's nothing left. And that's thus saith the Lord. And I have this here from Zero Hedge, which I'm not going to read this whole thing because it's pretty lengthy. But it says, global food prices hit 3-year high as war choke point, chaos, and El Nino spark perfect storm. It says the UN Food and Agricultural Organization's food price index climbed to a 3-year high in July, extending its upward trajectory as conflicts across Eurasia, the Black Sea, and the Hormuz choke point disrupt critical trade routes, and mounting El Nino risk threaten global harvests. When you look up what El Nino is, It says an irregularity occurring in complex series of climatic changes affecting the equatorial Pacific region and beyond every few years, characterized by the appearance of unusual warm nutrient-poor water off northern Peru and Ecuador, typically in late December. All right, so it says, let me see. Let me skip down. Here. It says, earlier this week, UBS analysts identified 5 long-term forces likely to keep global food inflation structurally higher above its pre-pan average of 2.5%. While food inflation globally has fallen from the COVID peak, a new debate is emerging. Is the C2.5% LT average obsolete? The London-based managing director and equity research analyst said. It says, I'm going to skip down. Perhaps Bank of America analyst Robert Ohms will be proven right about his warning in mid-June that another food price spike could arrive in supermarkets this fall. He said that grocery inflation may be on the way, citing a blend of index of wages, diesel, and commodity costs. So amidst these newly created viruses, that are being engineered by Esau's AI and scientists, you also have a global famine, all right, that is on the brink because of these rising escalations with the nations, all right? So essentially what's happening is a squeeze on all fronts, and the Lord spoke about the full storehouses being empty. This is 2 Ezra 6 and verse 22. It says, and suddenly shall the sown places appear unsown. The full storehouses shall be suddenly found empty. All right, and why are these things going to happen suddenly? Because for the majority of these people, they aren't paying attention. You ask the average American, they don't know anything that's taking place concerning the conflict with Iran, China, and Russia. All right, they don't know how these different skirmishes are affecting their home front. They don't know how the Strait of Hormuz, who has control over the Strait of Hormuz and trade and sanctions affect the American economy. They don't know these things. So for the majority of these people, suddenly the sown places are going to appear unsown. Suddenly these grocery stores aren't going to have the surplus that they have now. Suddenly the full storehouses are going to be found empty. All right? Because there's going to be a rush to procure food and resources. Pretty soon, inflation is going to reach to the point to where, people can't afford food. They can't afford to eat. They can't afford to eat and pay rent and pay bills. So it's going to come a time to where famine of bread, all right, is going to be a very effectual part of the, American society. People are going to feel it. And as they feel the famine, the scriptures speak about there being sedition among men. All right, because when people's stomachs are touching their back, the last thing they're thinking about is being civilized. All right, they're going to claw and teeth to get what they need, to fill that sugar addiction, to feed that drug addiction. They're going to do what they need to do to fill and to satiate those different addictions. Which we skip over the 2 Ezra 15, but let me get 16 real quick. Hold on. It's 2 Ezra 16 and verse 18. The beginning of sorrows and great mournings, the beginning of famine and great death, the beginning of wars, and the power shall stand in fear. The beginning of evils, what shall I do when these evils shall come? Behold, famine and plague, tribulation and anguish are sent as scourges for amendment. But for all these things that shall not turn from the wickedness, nor be always mindful of the scourges. Behold, victuals shall be so good cheap upon the earth that they shall think themselves to be in good case. And even then shall evils grow upon the earth, sword, famine, and great confusion. All right, and this is the point where we find ourselves now. It's where since victuals are seemingly cheap in the earth, people think themselves to be in a good case. All right. You can still go and get a decently priced meal to feed the family from a fast food restaurant or a cheap grocery store. So with that being the case, people are still able to use their WIC benefits. All right. The I forget what the name is. Food stamps. They're still able to use WIC benefits and food stamps to procure different resources and food. So they think that, they're in a good case. But all the while, they think they're in a good case, it says, even then shall evils grow up on the earth. And while these people think that they're in a good case, the Lord is slowly but surely igniting the fire concerning famine, igniting the fire concerning pestilence, igniting the fire concerning the sword being brought down upon the American people. All right, the Lord is igniting these fires right under the noses of these people. And all of these things are growing. And what we see now is verse 18, the beginnings. All right, this is the beginning of sorrow. This is the beginning of famine and great death, of pestilences and death overtaking the world. This is the beginning. This is what it looks like. This is what it feels like. But the majority of people can't identify what's taking place because they don't have the Spirit of the Lord and they aren't looking. So these things are going to overtake them suddenly. And when it reaches that point to where the inflation rises again to the point to where it's unsustainable, we're going to come to this point in 2 Kings 15 and verse 15. It says, for the sword and their destruction draweth nigh, one people shall stand up and fight against another, and swords in their hands. For there shall be sedition among men, and invading one another. They shall not regard their kings nor princes, and the course of their actions shall stand in their power. All right, essentially, like it says in Isaiah the 19th chapter, Egyptian is going to be set against Egyptian. All right, there's going to be a civil war. All right, race wars taking place. All right, class wars taking place, food wars, resource wars taking place because of the lack thereof. It says, a man shall desire to go into a city and shall not be able, for because of their pride the city shall be troubled, and the houses shall be destroyed, and men shall be afraid. A man shall have no pity upon his neighbor, but shall destroy their houses with the sword and spoil their goods because of the lack of bread and for great tribulation. All right, and the Lord is igniting the fire concerning great tribulation in the planet. Or eventually it's going to reach the point to where it's an uncontrollable fire. A lot of times with wildfires, they just got to let it burn. There's no amount of water that you can use to quench that fire. It just has to burn. And that's the point that we've reached here in the planet with prophecy. All right, in America. The Lord is just letting it burn. And eventually, the whole force is going to be overtaken. All right. And it's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time. All right. Because it surely as we're identifying these different ignition points that the Lord is using to ignite and to really fan the fire upon Babylon the Great in the world. Just as sure as we identify it, these other nations identify it. The elites are identifying it. That's why they're moving with great haste. That's why it says the devil is going to come down with great wrath because he knows that he has but a short time. It's only a matter of time. That's why it's important to hold on. Now's not the time to be in a quitting spirit, a lackluster or lukewarm spirit. All right, the Lord is moving speedily on the behalf of his elect. All right, and there are constant ignitions taking place. All right, for the elect's behalf. Lord willing, we're at that number. All right, the Lord is constantly igniting and blowing the flame. All right, and now it's come to the point to where, it's unignorable. You can't ignore it. Niggas like to ignore the little small brush fire, but when it turns into a wildfire, niggas can't ignore it, and that's the point where we're at now. People cannot ignore the fire that is being lit in the planet Earth. But with that being said, Lord, once edifying, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashum, Yahushai, Bahashum, Rachakodash, and double honors to our apostles and elders of Great Millstone who rule well. Shalom, stay up.